Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at elasticity of demand and supply, so looking at the key factors impacting elasticity, and then the next video we'll look at relative prices. So before we get on to that, there's a really important concept. When you're doing these questions like this, there's often a sequence of questions that come from a graph. So if you get a graph like this, the first question on the exam was describe the change in demand for cups of coffee from D1 to D2 and explain one microeconomic factor that may have caused this. So it's really important that you articulate that the demand curve has shifted to the right, which means there's now more demand for coffee cups at any given price. Okay, so this means consumers are more willing to buy coffee cups at any given price. At a price of $3, 1,600 coffee cups are demanded as opposed to 800, so really articulating using the quantities. This may be due to a higher price for a substitute like tea, or higher disposable incomes or lower interest rates or something like that. Articulate really clearly that the demand curve has shifted to the right, which means that there's more demand at any given price. Provide an example using the figures. Now there's 1,600 units instead of 800 units. Explain how the equilibrium market price and quantity adjust from E1 to E2. So the initial increase in market demand for coffee cups created a market shortage at the original price of $3, as quantity demand has increased from 800 cups to 1,600 cups. If I give you the quantities, or if you've given the quantities in an exam, you need to articulate what's happened using the quantities. So the coffee cups has gone from 800, the demand, has gone from 800 to 1,600 at the old price of $3. This created a shortage of 800 coffee cups. The shortage put upward pressure on prices as coffee shops realised the potential for greater profitability. As the price increased to $4, there was a contraction in demand because some people couldn't afford it. There was also an expansion in supply. So that contraction is from 1,600 to 1,200. Supply expands from 800 to 1,200. With the market eventually settling at a new equilibrium point of E2, with 1,200 cups of coffee now being demanded and supplied at a new price of $4. Using as much information from the graph as you possibly can. The third question was, with reference to this market, briefly explain the role of the price mechanism in changing the pattern of resource allocations, which is a fancy way of saying, in this market, what impact did the change in prices have on how resources were allocated? So the initial increase in demand for cups of coffee created a shortage and placed upward pressure on market prices. As the market price increased relative to cost of production, it became relatively more profitable to supply cups of coffee, so there was an expansion in supply and more resources were allocated to production of that product. This is because producers respond to the higher price signals and would allocate more land, labour and capital resources into the product because it's more profitable. So the price mechanism is the force of demand and supply and how they determine relative prices. When you're explaining how it affects resources, you need to articulate that when the price increased, there was an expansion in supply, which means that self-interested, profit-motivated producers allocated more resources to the production of coffee because it was now a more profitable or viable item to produce. In this question here, I'm going to give you a similar question that asks you, explain why wine growers allocated more resources to wine production. In your answer, refer to the diagram as well as relative prices. That was the question from a past SAC, so you may have seen this. And what you need to be able to do, you get 2 marks for an explanation, 0.5 marks for referencing the diagram, and 0.5 marks for reference to relative prices. So why did we produce more wine once the price went from A to B? Explain with reference to relative prices. It's not enough to just do the equilibrium analysis here. You need to do that, but you need to articulate exactly what that means to reallocate resources with examples of how they could have reallocated their resources. So here's the answer. The higher demand for Australian wine has caused the price of wine to increase from P1 to P2. Again, you are asked to reference the graph, so refer to figures. You don't have numbers, but you can still refer to the P1, P2, Q1, Q2, which resulted in an increase in the supply of wine and expansion from Q1 to Q2. As wine producers now expect higher profits to be made from wine production. That's why they shift resources. The expansion of supply necessarily requires more resources, land, labour and capital to be used in the production of wine. So what's likely to have happened when this occurred? When the price of wine increases, resources that were once used for other products are likely to be reallocated away from those products whose relative price is now lower and into wine. For example, to the extent that wine producers use part of their land and machinery to cultivate other crops, the higher price of wine means that the relative price of those other crops is now lower. In response, the wine producer will shift more of his or her resources to the production of wine and will allocate fewer resources to the production of other crops. Note, it is expected that some students will refer to the higher relative price of wine for export compared to the price... don't worry about that. Okay, so to articulate this here, you need to explain what's happened in the graph. The higher demand led to a higher price. Resources, the supply of wine increased from Q1 to Q2. This is because producers are profit motivated. Resources that were once used in for other areas, for example, their land, their machinery that was used for other crops, will now be converted into wine because it's now relatively more profitable. Resources that were once used for other things are now being used for wine because of its higher price, because of the higher demand. That's what you need to articulate if you get a similar question to this. It's not enough to just say supply expanded. You need to articulate why resources moved. Now we're going to look at elasticity. Okay, in terms of elasticity, there's key things, factors that impact elasticity of demand and factors that impact elasticity of supply. Factors impacting elasticity of demand, the degree of necessity. The more of a necessity is, the more inelastic. And again, make sure you know how the curves look. So your inelastic demand curve looks like this. If it becomes more elastic, it becomes more horizontal. So if something's more of a necessity, it will have the more inelastic demand curve. Availability of substitutes. When more substitutes are in the market, it becomes more elastic because when the price increases, we can easily shift into other viable products. Proportion of income. Products that are higher proportion of income are generally more elastic because we care more when the price increases, and therefore we're more likely to drop off. And time. Things are more elastic in the long term because we can find viable substitutes. So if the price of petrol increases, initially we might keep buying petrol so the demand's not overly responsive to the change in price. Then as time goes by, we might decide to convert to an electric car. We might move houses so that we can save money on petrol. We may use public transport. There are more options available in the long term. We might convert our car to gas. Products are more responsive to changes in price. So demand is more responsive to change in price in the long term. In terms of factors impacting elasticity of supply, make sure you don't use these ones. The key ones to use are spare capacity. So the more spare capacity you have in an industry means you've got idle resources and therefore you can use them in production quickly and therefore respond faster to an increase in price. Production period, so how long it takes you to make something. So for example, if it's a house, it takes a long period of time to make, so it's more inelastic. It's easy to make, then it will take a very short period of time, then we can respond quickly to higher prices. And durability of goods, goods that last a long time can be stored, and therefore they can be quickly supplied when prices increase. So here's an example. I did show you this one in class. The price of petrol fell significantly in 2015. With reference to the concept of elasticity, explain the impact lower petrol prices are likely to have on household budgets. So to define price elasticity of demand, make sure, if you don't do this well already, make sure you write this out a couple of times before your SAC. So price elasticity of demand measures the percentage change in quantity demanded resulting from a given percentage change in price. Because petrol is generally considered inelastic or having a low PED, and that's because it has very few substitutes and is deemed as a necessity, lower petrol prices will not necessarily result in consumers choosing to drive their car a lot more. Okay, so that won't lead to a big increase in demand. So the total amount spent on petrol is likely to fall. And because of this, that will free up a lot more money for other things in the household budget, so other products that you can buy. And if the demand was more elastic, that would mean that when the prices went down, people would buy a lot more petrol, so they wouldn't necessarily have more money for other things. Identify and explain two factors that determine elasticity of supply. Okay, it's not enough just to list them. You need to explain how they impact elasticity of supply. So two factors, resource mobility and time since the change in price. If, for example, labour and capital resources are more mobile, we can quickly reallocate them in response to a price rise. Make sure you're linking it to price every single time. For example, if miners start getting paid more, we can quickly shift resources towards mining. This is less applicable to the medical profession. I mean, cleaning is probably a better example than mining just because resources are more mobile in that industry. It's probably less skilled. This is less applicable to the medical profession because people take time to be trained, therefore they're less responsive to changes in price. As time goes by, there is also more time to shift resources to where they are demanded in response to higher prices, and therefore the supply becomes more elastic. Explain why the price elasticity of supply for sugary drinks is likely to be relatively high. Again, really important here that you demonstrate an understanding of PES, and then link it to why the PES for SSBs would be quite elastic. The PES of SSBs is likely to be relatively high because they are relatively durable products. They can be stored and preserved in a bottle, and then you need to link it to why that means they're more elastic. So that you've chosen your factor, durability. Therefore, when prices rise, this will be typically followed by a relatively quick response by producers who can offer SSBs for sale in a relatively short period of time. In this respect, the quantity supplied to the market will change more than proportionally to a change in price. Again, you've got to make sure you define the key term in your answer, the fact that they're durable is your factor, and therefore they can be stored. This means that when prices increase, they can quickly be supplied to the market, and therefore the quantity supplied varies more than proportionally to a change in price. Define price elasticity of supply and describe one factor that might increase the PES in the wine market. So again, your first mark is clearly for your definition. The PES is the responsiveness of the quantity supplied to a product to a change in price. The PES is likely to increase if there is a rise in spare capacity. So some of you probably would have gone straight to durability or storability, and you'd have to articulate that because they can be stored, for example, in large caskets, they can quickly be supplied when the price increases, and therefore they're more elastic. But in this case, we're looking at spare capacity. So if wine growers will be able to respond faster to higher prices if they're not working to their capacity, working to their productive capacity, or they have what we call low capacity utilization. With low capacity utilization, underutilized resources like labour and machinery can be quickly developed to expand volumes. For example, if there's a higher price because of stronger Chinese demand, this will result in a relatively speedy increase in wine production if wineries are not operating at their full capacity. If we are at our full capacity, it's really hard for us to increase output, and therefore it will be a less elastic supply when prices increase. So it's all about underutilized resources, spare capacity, spare labour, spare land, spare, you might have spare capital resources as well, so spare barrels and spare other machinery you'd use to make wines. Explain why the price elasticity of supply for a tin of baby formula is likely to be relatively high compared to a fresh carton of milk. The PES is the responsiveness of the quantity supplied of a product to a change in price. Define the term. The PES for baby formula compared to a litre of milk is likely to be more elastic because it is durable and less perishable. Producers are therefore able to stockpile large quantities of baby formula and respond to higher demand and higher prices by increasing their supply significantly, as opposed to fresh milk, which can go off quickly. Explain why there is a difference in the elasticity of supply of canned and fresh tomatoes. Again, all of these questions are very similar. Given that canned tomatoes are relatively non-perishable and can be stored for a long period of time, producers can easily stockpile supplies and respond quickly when prices rise. When the price of canned tomatoes increases, producers can quickly respond by increasing supply. Accordingly, the quantity supplied is highly responsive to price changes. In contrast, fresh tomatoes are more perishable and can only be stored for relatively shorter periods of time. So when the price of fresh tomatoes increases, producers cannot increase supply to the market as quickly as they can for tinned tomatoes. They may need time to, for example, it may take time for producers to respond because they need to plant seeds, and that can take up to 90 days. So if it takes a long time to grow tomatoes, you can't just have them in the market straight away. Similar question, I'm not going to go through that. Talk about relative prices in the next